Redditors who have gone to war with a neighbor. What's your story? My parents' neighbor constantly blows his leaves onto my parents' property. My dad tried to confront him a few times and the guy literally ran away every time. Yes, a grown butt man dropped his leaf blower and ran inside and locked the door and pretended not to be home when he saw my dad coming. On multiple occasions. My father is not a scary man. My dad was finally able to confront him one day. He was super polite and said the guy could blow the leaves into their woods, but just not onto their clean lawn. The guy responded, "Your property doesn't start until 10 feet from the road, so you can't do anything about it. If you want me to stop, sue me." This is technically correct, as the property is off a private road owned by a convent, and per state law the owner of the road also owns the 10 feet of land on either side of the road. So, my dad called up the convent and asked if the neighbor is allowed to dump his leaves on their property. Turns out they don't like that, so now instead of being in a neighborly argument with my parents, he's trying to fight a bunch of nuns in court. Not a good look. I can see that headline now. Nuns throw good book at leaf blowing blowhard. Two neighbors, we will call them A and B, who hated each other. Neighbor A really prided his lawn on being pristine and caused neighbor B no end of grief over things like leaves and lawn clippings ending up on his lawn even if just because of wind. Police were called multiple times. This went on for a year. Neighbor B got fed up and intentionally planted clover in his lawn. He waited for it to flower and then set up an industrial fan to blow into neighbor A's lawn. I aspire to this man's level of pettiness every day. Should throw birdseed onto his lawn as well. It's more of a Cold War situation. When my boyfriend cuts the grass, even if our neighbor just cut his grass a few days prior, our neighbor, will cut his again the next day. He's an old man who can't stand to have his lawn just a smidge taller than ours. My neighbor and I have a silent agreement where we mow each other's side of the lawn up to the driveway to avoid this. One day he did the favor for me. The next week I did it for him and so on. Never got brought up and it's going on to be a 4-year tradition. It's nice because it makes our 45 rotations look seamless and really only adds on 10 minutes to the mow. Had a crappy neighbor that lived downstairs. Did all sorts of loud crap late into the night, usually music and friends. One day I had enough and after about 10 minutes of very loud music I just started stomping on the floor. He came bursting out of his apartment and pounding on my door. I answered, acting very confused. "You need to stop stomping around. I'm trying to work." "I wasn't stomping." "Yes you were. I was dancing to your crappy music. Turn it down and it'll never happen again." It never happened again. When I was in elementary school, our neighbor's 4 dogs would always poop in our backyard. My mom asked the neighbor many times to pick it up, but he never did. So every morning before school, my mom would send me and my brother on poop patrol. At first we just put the poop in the neighbor's yard, but our neighbor never got the hint. My mom then had us put the poop on his porch and then he got a fence. Looks like you needed a trebuchet. Obviously the right siege weapon for the job. Capable of launching 90 kilograms of poop over 300 meters. Well, it all started one day when they were having their fence put in and one of the workers accidentally snapped one of our tomato plants at the base. So she decided to take it inside and cook all of the green tomatoes into this unbelievably yummy Indian food I can't even begin to pronounce or spell and brought it over as an apology. Then we made fresh cut pasta and gave them some to give the container back because we of course didn't want to keep it. Then they had the audacity to make us some Indian dessert thing that tasted like heaven. By then our garden had started to produce, so we gave them 2 bags of produce that would have gone to waste and they gave you some eggplant dish. So we brought over a tray of cookies and now it's 3 years later and we're in a heated war over who can outfood the other. We're fighting a losing battle though because they are vegetarian and we are not, so we have to modify most of what we make for them, but we have a huge vegetable garden so we have the leg up on that. This is how you're supposed to neighbor. My parents have become best friends with theirs. Keys to each other's houses and all that. They pull pranks on one another and sometimes leave each other food. I once heard the back door open and by the time I got to check it out, there was a rack of ribs still hot wrapped in foil and a dish towel. They're the best. Years ago my upstairs neighbors were wanted felons living in an apartment leased by the lady's brother. They sold drugs out of there. They fricked all times of the day. Loud music 8 AM to 12 AM. Locked their daughter outside for hours at a time so we would do things with her and give her snacks, but you could tell her social and educational development was way behind. After finding their pictures online on the MN50 Most Wanted, I called the police and they didn't believe me. They called me a child. I was 22. All while the neighbors' behavior got worse as more people reported them. It took them 4 months and dozens of phone calls to finally get the police to arrest fugitives they were supposedly looking for. You'd figure that someone with a statewide arrest warrant would lay the frick low and keep to themselves, but I guess wanted criminals aren't usually known for their logical thinking. We had some problems with our former neighbor. He would come over and yell at us over the most random things that were A, never actually wrong, and or B, not actually our fault. Once he came over on a Sunday morning ringing our doorbell and throwing a tantrum about some vines growing on the back fence. My husband went back there with him to check things out, and sure enough, they were growing up from the neighbor's side. Another time my husband was out in our driveway washing out a couple of flower pots and the dude came out of his house and started screaming at us about spraying dirty water into his yard. We weren't. He also called the fire department on us for smoking a brisket. Just lots of small weird incidents like that. This was a relatively normal guy in his 40s with a job, wife and 2 kids, and we live in a pretty nice suburban neighborhood. LOL. It wasn't like it was some crazy old crackpot. They sold the house and moved last year. Thank goodness. And we found out later they'd divorced and apparently had some pretty big financial issues. I guess maybe it was the stress of what was going on in his life, just taking it out on us. Sounds like a man who had no control over things in his life and was grasping at straws for a little control over anything. Hope he's doing better now at least. Background. I use my bicycle to ride to the train station pretty much every day, having to go over the sidewalk for a grand amount of 10 meters before entering the street. File a complaint on him for harassment. My newish neighbor was a goddamn sex maniac. Every night I heard him screwing his boyfriend, and they were loud. I live in a house with a good amount of space between my home and his. Even with our windows closed I could hear them screaming like feral cats. My husband finally had enough of it, so he went next door to tell them, politely, to take it down a notch. The next morning he found a giant dildo with a suction cup on the bottom stuck on the hood of his car with "Freak You" carved into the side of the car. His brand new car. Cops were called. They denied it. We had it on camera. They were M-heads. Don't do M, kids. On a week-long cruise. First 2 mornings our neighbors on both sides were ridiculously loud, basically screaming in Spanish and constantly waking us up. We didn't go to bed until 3-4 am, so they cut into your sleep. On third night at around 10-11 pm we go to our room. Blasted the TV. Side note, TVs on cruises should be programmed to not go as loud as we made it, and left it like that until 3-4 am. You could hear it outside our door. It was very loud, like they were. Next morning, what do you know, the neighbors realized other people can hear them and were quiet the rest of the cruise. One of the few times that being passive aggressive worked out. Live in a dorm with shared kitchen and toilet. One neighbor refused to buy toilet paper and always stole food. During a summer break only him and me were living at the dorm and he continued the practice, so I made some stew and put a lot of laxatives in it. I also left only 1 roll of toilet paper in the bathroom that was covered in itching powder. He was pee, but I'll laugh whenever he tries to scold me for it. I lived next door to a C club for years. They'd start up around 11 pm or midnight and go till dawn. The cops, Brooklyn, were clearly on the take, as they'd repeatedly tell me during the day that the place had been closed down, and yet they were showing up 3 or 4 times a week there to deal with fights. I asked one of them about why they couldn't close the place at 4 am one day after a particularly noisy fight, and they wouldn't even look me in the eye. We had a huge number of beer bottles because I also used the place as a performance rehearsal space, so at a certain point I'd start throwing bottles out my window to smash their back door when they were noisy. They really hated that, but as I pointed out, what were they going to do? Call the cops? So they eventually managed to keep the noise down. It kinda worked out. Eventually they were gentrified out of existence. Apu. Well, if the police won't help us, I guess we'll just have to take the law into our own hands. Chief Wiggum. Yeah, a lot of people are doing that these days. I told this story about a year ago. Many years ago as a student I rented a downstairs suite in an old post-war bungalow. Initially there was a nice old guy upstairs but he left, and this awful hillbilly family with a dog moved in. The wife was the worst sort of human garbage, always angry and yelling profanities at her kids and husband all the time. The guy drank like a fish. I don't think I ever saw him sober. Living with that harridan I have no doubts as to why. During the day the harridan was usually drinking and or stoned to the point of insensibility. So instead of letting the dog out in the yard she just let the dog downstairs. There was an area in front of my door downstairs with maybe 20 square feet of floor. And the dog would crap there. It started out once a week but quickly got worse. I tried to talk to them about it but that bee literally screamed at me. Told me that because the crap was on my floor that it was my mess to deal with. I called the landlord several times but he didn't care. I was paying my very cheap rent and that's all that mattered. I considered all sorts of things to stop the problem, but there was no such thing as renters' rights back then, and as long as it was happening in a private dwelling they were breaking no laws. I didn't want to hurt the dog. He was actually a nice, friendly lab shepherd mix. Huge dog with huge turds but other than that we got along fine. It was clearly the owners who were the problem. I had to put up with it for another 3 months. I didn't have anywhere else to go and I couldn't afford to move at the drop of a hat. I needed 3 months rent in my pocket to pay a new damage deposit and advance rent to get into a new apartment. I had to skip meals and stopped using my car to save enough. I didn't tell them I was leaving and I moved out when they weren't home. I had collected the dog crap for a few weeks into a 5-gallon bucket. It was about 3/4 full. Before I left I gave it back to them through their front door mail slot, on their floor. So their mess, right? Lived in a dorm with 5 other guys in college and had to move out to the dorm across the quad building. It was a total of like 40 featuring move. Below us were the soccer players. They were a rowdy bunch and often partied until 3-4 am with loud music and drinking. Oftentimes we could feel the floor vibrate and we called safety services on them to get them to quiet down. Well, when we were moving they decided to egg our door. We called safety services who claimed they didn't have cameras up on that particular set of dorms. So using this information we egged them back and got safety service called on us. They said they knew we did it, they saw the footage, but if they punished us, they would also have to punish the soccer players. We also found out how to stop their music by trying to connect to their Bluetooth speaker. A few years ago, my parents were having an issue with the neighbor's dog crapping nearly exclusively in their lawn. My dad worked away from home a lot, and my mom is too timid to say anything, and just picks it up. She would complain about it all the time, but never actually say anything to the neighbors. One day, I had enough of her complaining to me, so I went over to the neighbors to discuss the issue. Their response was that they just couldn't keep the dog in the yard. I suggested a tie-out cable, and they said they'd look into it. No tie-out cable was purchased, and the dog kept crapping in my parents' yard, so I went back over to let them know it was still happening. The response this time was that they would start picking it up right away. A couple weeks later, I go over to mow my parents' lawn, and guess what I step in? I grabbed a plastic bag and picked up 9 piles of crap, tied it off, and left it at the neighbor's front door. Went about mowing the lawn, then went home. Mom calls me later that night and tells me the husband came over and bitched her out for the bag. Next week I go back to mow the lawn and there are 3 piles of crap 10 feet into my parents' property. I took a 9-iron and splattered them all over the side of the neighbor's house. Grabbed a lawn chair and a beer and waited in my parents' driveway until the neighbors came home with my crappy 9-iron. Husband sees it and storms over, cussing me out along the way. I told him that every time I find a pile in the yard, it's getting the same treatment. My parents don't own a dog. They shouldn't have to pick up dog crap. His wife is yelling at him in the background telling him it's not worth it and to get in the house. He calls me a little bee and walks away. Never had another problem with crap. Just dirty looks. You should buy dog crap from people maybe once a month and just splatter it across his wall. My neighbor is going to war with me because I took issue with his dog. I love a behaved pooch, but I don't appreciate getting nose fricked by a dog while his owner just watches. So I asked him to leash his pup. He's done everything but use a leash, like building a barrier on the porch and training his dog. I don't have to shield my crotch when coming home anymore, so I don't care. My super sweet, but super gossipy downstairs neighbor asked how I was handling the obvious defiance and disrespect. I told her that I actually prefer this arrangement because I believe in doggy freedom, but the leash route is backed by law and feels less confrontational than have some freaking manners and train your dog. She must have let my feelings slip because he is now escalated to taking my parking spot, seeing as it's one space closer. It's a small parking lot, so it's for nothing else than to be petty. Thing is, I prefer this arrangement as well. I had been parking under a tree and dealing with a ton of bird crap. Space is limited, so I've considered it my cross to bear rather than force a neighbor to deal with it. His dong move is saving me a weekly trip to the car wash. He's the best worst neighbor I've ever had. I can't wait to see how gets revenge on me next. Long story short, neighbor kept driving over our fence. My mum planted trees along whole east side by his property. This was 20 years ago. He no longer has any sunshine after 6 PM. Savage. Free shade. Nice. Not much of a war yet, but our neighbors shared the driveway when we moved in. But the entirety of the driveway is on our property. Well, we ended up catching them outside and told them we were putting up a fence and gate because of issues with the utility company. No worries, they were renters. Fence goes up. 2 weeks later, owner of neighbor's property shows up. He's maybe 80, gets out of a huge truck and proceeds to try and yank up the fence posts with his hands. I'm sitting on my porch at the other end of the property, waiting on this guy to have a stroke. We've been finding warnings to remove the fence so I can use my driveway or else stuck to the fence. I will never understand sharing driveways for this reason alone. Back in like 2009 to 2010 I was at war with my downstairs neighbor. She would hit her ceiling with a broomstick, and I would point my bass speaker down toward the floor. I got pregnant with twins that were high risk, and got a temporary handicapped placard for parking closer. She borrowed one and took my spot. Few months go by of straight war. Then I had my twins. I'll be damned if we didn't stop fricking with each other, and that woman was the only person to help me. We became best friends, and still are to this day. We still laugh at our silly war. Thank you, Heather. There's lots of background to this, but here is the final highlight of our experience. I woke up on morning AMD, headed out to my car to go to the store. My entire driver's side door and passenger door have deep scratches in them. Neighbor's craphead kids took gravel to my car. Call the cops. Kids admit to it. Neighbor says she'll pay the damage, then reneges when she finds out it's close to $3,000 damage. Our insurance covers it, but we civil sue them for the deduction we had to pay plus the cost of the security camera we installed after this event. Should have done that sooner, as their kids broke many things of ours. They try to counter sue with a whole bunch of absolute bulls we won, but they skipped town a month later. Dog kept chewing through old fence. Kept coming up with excuses why he wouldn't pay his half to replace the fence. We shouldn't have had to pay any of it, since it would have been structurally fine if his dog didn't keep chewing holes in it and escaping into our backyard. We decided to start leaving our side gate open. The dog would chew through and then go wandering through the neighborhood. After the third pickup from the pound, he decided to buy scrap wood and patch up the holes. When we lived in the suburbs of Los Angeles, we had a trucker that lived next to us with his 2 kids. His son was a few years older than me and would constantly harass me to the point where I either wouldn't go outside without my older brothers or not at all. One Saturday around noon, I was inside playing NES while my dad and my brothers played basket in the driveway. My mom was at work. Our trucker neighbor came outside and cussed out my dad for playing basketball so loud so early. I mean, it was 12:30 on a Saturday afternoon. This is when I came outside. My dad told us to ignore him, and I had now joined, went back to the game. A few minutes he came back outside with a switchblade knife, took the ball from my 14-year-old brother's hand, and popped it. It was at this point that my dad told us all to run over to the neighbor's house across the street and lock the door, which we did. I saw my dad duking it out with this beastly truck driver until the cops showed up. The trucker got 1 hit in on him and my dad got at least 3. The police arrested him based on what witnesses had said for assault with a deadly weapon, and we moved a month later across town, which was for the better. My dad can beat up your dad. Not me, but my grandpa really did go to war in Vietnam. He was a Marine, and his neighbor down the street, parents' house at the time as he was around 20, also got drafted with him. So he literally went to war with a neighbor. You sneaky, maliciously compliant bastard. I love you. Used to have a neighbor who would let her kids come upstairs and play on my apartment porch. It wasn't a big deal until they started leaving behind a mess. I asked her to keep them off my porch and she let me know they were allowed to play wherever they want. The trash and mess continued for a good 4 months. I came home exhausted one day and my porch was decorated in sidewalk chalk and finger paint. So I bring out the bucket of water and start cleaning just for her to yell at me from downstairs that I'm getting her porch wet and ruining her welcome mat, her all-weather mat. So I dump the bucket of water on my porch and it runs off onto her while she's bitching. She decides to checkmate me and starts smoking at the top of the stairs, letting her second-hand smoke waft freely into my apartment. I complain to management and they tell her about the laws of 25 feet away from any working entrance and she has to smoke in her house or off property. This bee takes out her bedroom screen and stands in her home, smoking out the window. Our apartments were set up in a way that allowed no ventilation in the front so the smoke kept coming up to my apartment. That's when I discovered you can buy skunk spray online. Apparently hunters use it for something. I lined the tracks of her windows with it. She finally started leaving the property to smoke and her kids stopped visiting my porch. Apparently hunters use it for something. Covers up your human scent. When my parents' neighborhood was developed, our neighbor was friends with the developer and had his yard made a smaller size than ours because we share a drainage ditch in the middle and they didn't want to pay property taxes on the unusable space. Now we have new neighbors and they are constantly cutting our grass because they believe it's divided right down the middle. There are city tax records and property records that prove this, but they continue to do it. If I go to my parents to cut the grass, they will quick run out and do the perimeter of their yard before I get to it. I know it's petty and over 6 feet of grass, but it's the principle. Put up a cheap fence on the property line. Bing bang boom. Problem solved. This is so dumb. My neighbor got pissed that I hung up a bird feeder on my property, stating it attracted birds. I said, well, that's the point. To which he goes on a tirade about how he pays taxes and the birds don't, and that they were destroying his house, blah blah blah. This is all well and good until I just stopped responding to him and he brings up my ex-girlfriend by saying no wonder that bee moved out. It was an amicable breakup, so this was not an okay thing to say on many levels. I resisted the urge to punch him right then and there and calmly got into my car, drove to the nearest Lowe's, and bought a few more bird feeders to hang all around my property. I glared at him the whole time I was installing them. It's been 2 years, and he hasn't spoken to me since. I had never had a problem with him before that, and I rarely even converse with my neighbors because I normally keep to myself. Bloody birds, using all our public services and not paying any dang taxes. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.